This is a really extraordinary honor for me. I spend most of my time in jails, in prisons, on death row. I spend most of my time in very low-income communities, in the projects, in places where there's a great deal of hopelessness. And being here at TED and seeing the stimulation, hearing it, has been very, very energizing to me. And one of the things that's emerged in my short time here is that TED has an identity. And you can actually say things here that have impacts around the world, and sometimes when it comes through TED, it has meaning and power that it doesn't have when it doesn't. And I mention that because I think identity is really important. And we've had some fantastic presentations, and I think what we've learned is that if you're a teacher, your words can be meaningful, but if you're a compassionate teacher, they can be especially meaningful. If you're a doctor, you can do some good things, but if you're a caring doctor, you can do some other things. So I want to talk about the power of identity. And I didn't learn about this actually practicing law and doing the work that I do. I actually learned about this from my grandmother. I grew up in a house that was the traditional African-American home that was dominated by a matriarch, and that matriarch was my grandmother. She was tough, she was strong, she was powerful. She was the end of every argument in our family. She was the beginning of a lot of arguments in our family. She was the daughter of people who were actually enslaved. Her parents were born in slavery in Virginia in the 1840s. She was born in the 1880s, and the experience of slavery very much shaped the way she saw the world. My grandmother was tough, but she was also loving. When I would see her as a little boy, she'd come up to me and she'd give me these hugs, and she'd squeeze me so tight I could barely breathe. And then she'd let me go. And an hour or two later, if I saw her, she'd come over to me and she'd say, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And if I said no, she'd assault me again, and if I'd say yes, she'd leave me alone. And she just had this quality that you always wanted to be near her. And the only challenge was that she had 10 children. My mom was the youngest of her 10 kids, and sometimes when I would go and spend time with her, it'd be difficult to get her time and attention. My cousins would be running around everywhere, and I remember when I was about 8 or 9 years old, waking up one morning, going into the living room, and all of my cousins were running around, and my grandmother was sitting across the room staring at me. And at first I thought we were playing a game. And I would look at her and I'd smile, but she was very serious. And after about 15 or 20 minutes of this, she got up and she came across the room and she took me by the hand and she said, "Come on, Bryan, you and I are going to have a talk." And I remember this just like it happened yesterday. I never will forget it. She took me out back and she said, "Bryan, I'm going to tell you something, but you don't tell anybody what I tell you." I said, "Okay, Mom." She said, "Now you make sure you don't do that." I said, "Sure." Then she sat me down and she looked at me and she said, "I want you to know I've been watching you." And she said, "I think you're special." She said, "I think you can do anything you want to do." I will never forget it. And then she said, "I just need you to promise me 3 things, Bryan." I said, "Okay, Mom." And she said, "The first thing I want you to promise me is that you'll always love your mom." She said, "That's my baby girl, and you have to promise me now you'll always take care of her." Well, I adored my mom, so I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." Then she said, "The second thing I want you to promise me is that you'll always do the right thing, even when the right thing is the hard thing." And I thought about it, and I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." Then finally she said, "The third thing I want you to promise me is that you'll never drink alcohol." Well, I was 9 years old, so I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." I grew up in the country in the rural South, and I have a brother a year older than me and a sister a year younger. And when I was about 14 or 15, one day my brother came home, and he had this 6-pack of beer. I don't know where he got it. And he grabbed me and my sister, and we went out in the woods, and we were kind of just out there doing the stuff we crazily did. And he had a sip of this beer, and he gave some to my sister, and she had some, and they offered it to me. And I said, no, that's okay. Y'all go ahead. I'm not going to have any beer. And my brother said, "Come on, we're doing this today. You always do what we do. I had some, your sister had some. Have some beer." I said, "No, I don't feel right about that. Y'all go ahead. And then my brother started staring at me. He said, what's wrong with you? Have some beer." Then he looked at me real hard. He said, "Oh, I hope you're not still hung up on that conversation Mama had with you." I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" He said, "Oh, Mama tells all the grandkids that they're special." I was devastated. And I'm going to admit something to you. I'm going to tell you something I probably shouldn't. I know might be broadcast broadly, but I'm 52 years old, and I'm going to admit to you that I've never had a drop of alcohol. I don't say that because I think that's virtuous. I say that because there is power in identity. When we create the right kind of identity, we can say things to the world around us that they don't actually believe make sense. We can get them to do things that they don't think they can do. When I thought about my grandmother, of course she would think all her grandkids were special. My grandfather was in prison during Prohibition. My male uncles died of alcohol-related diseases. And these were the things she thought we needed to commit to. Well, I've been trying to say something about our criminal justice system. This country is very different today than it was 40 years ago. In 1972, there were 300,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, there are 2.3 million. We have a system of justice in this country that treats you much better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. Right now in Alabama, 34% of the black male population has permanently lost the right to vote. We're actually projecting in another 10 years the level of disenfranchisement will be as high as it's been since prior to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and there is this stunning silence. For every 9 people who have been executed, we've actually identified one innocent person who's been exonerated and released from death row. A kind of astonishing error rate. 1 out of 9 people, innocent. I mean, it's fascinating. In aviation, we would never let people fly on airplanes if for every 9 planes that took off, 1 would crash. I was giving this lecture in Germany, some lectures in Germany about the death penalty. It was fascinating because one of the scholars stood up after the presentation and said, well, you know, it's deeply troubling to hear what you're talking about. I said, well, we don't have the death penalty in Germany. And of course, we can never have the death penalty in Germany. For me, that means spending time thinking and talking about the poor, the disadvantaged, those who will never get to TED, but thinking about them in a way that is integrated in our own lives. I had the great privilege when I was a young lawyer of meeting Rosa Parks. And after a couple of hours, Ms. Parks turned to me and she said, now, Bryan, tell me what the Equal Justice Initiative is. Tell me what you're trying to do. I began giving her my rap. I said, well, we're trying to challenge injustice. We're trying to help people who've been wrongly convicted. We're trying to confront bias and discrimination in the administration of criminal justice. We're trying to end life without parole sentences for children. We're trying to do something about the death penalty. We're trying to reduce the prison population. We're trying to end mass incarceration. I gave her my whole rap, and when I finished, she looked at me and she said, She said, that's going to make you tired. And that's when Miss Carr leaned forward. She put her finger on my face and said, that's why you've got to be brave. And I actually believe that the TED community needs to be more courageous. I sometimes get out of balance. I'll end with this story. I sometimes push too hard. I do get tired, as we all do. Sometimes those ideas get ahead of our kind of thinking in ways that are important. And I've been representing these kids who've been sentenced to do these very harsh sentences, and I go to the jail and I see my client who's 13 and 14 and he's been certified to stand trial as an adult, and I start thinking, well, how did that happen? How can a judge turn you into something that you're not? And the judge has certified him as an adult, but I see this kid, and I was up too late one night, and I started thinking, well, gosh, if the judge can turn you into something that you're not, the judge must have magic power. I said, yeah, Bryan, the judge has some magic power. You should ask for some of that. And because I was up too late and wasn't thinking real straight, I started working on a motion. And I had a client who was 14 years old, a young, poor black kid, and I started working on this motion, and the head of the motion was a motion to try my poor 14-year-old black male client like a privileged white 75-year-old corporate executive. And I put in my motion that there was prosecutorial misconduct and police misconduct and judicial misconduct. There was a crazy line in there about how there's no conduct in this county, it's all misconduct. And the next morning I woke up and I thought, now, did I dream that crazy motion or did I actually write it? And to my horror, not only had I written it, but I had sent it to court. A couple months went by and I just had forgotten all about it. And I finally decided, oh gosh, I got to go to the court and do this crazy case. And I got in my car and I was feeling really overwhelmed. And I got in my car and I went to this courthouse and I was sitting, oh, this is going to be so difficult, so painful. And I finally got out of the car and I started walking up to the courthouse. And as I was walking up the steps of this courthouse, there was an older black man who was the janitor in this courthouse. When this man saw me, he came over to me and he said, who are you? I said, I'm a lawyer. He said, you're a lawyer? I said, yes, sir. And this man came over to me and he hugged me. And he whispered in my ear, he said, I'm so proud of you. And I have to tell you, it was energizing. It connected deeply with something in me about identity, about the capacity of every person to contribute to a community, to perspective that is hopeful. Well, I went into the courtroom, and as soon as I walked inside, the judge saw me coming in. He said, Mr. Stevenson, did you write this crazy motion? I said, yes, sir, I did. And we started arguing. People started coming in because they were just outraged. I had written these crazy things. And police officers were coming in, and assistant prosecutors and clerk workers. And before I knew it, the courtroom was filled with people angry that we were talking about race, that we were talking about poverty, that we were talking about inequality. And out of the corner of my eye, I could see this janitor pacing back and forth, and he kept looking through the window, and he could hear all of this hollering. He kept pacing back and forth. And finally, this older black man, with this very worried look on his face, came into the courtroom and sat down behind me, almost at counsel table. About 10 minutes later, the judge said we would take a break, and during the break, there was a deputy sheriff who was offended that the janitor had come into court. And this deputy jumped up, and he ran over to this older black man. He said, Jimmy, what are you doing in this courtroom? This older black man stood up, and he looked at that deputy, and he looked at me, and he said, I came into this courtroom to tell this young man, keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. I've come to TED because I believe that many of you understand that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. That we cannot be full, evolved human beings until we care about human rights and basic dignity. That all of our survival is tied to the survival of everyone. That our visions of technology and design and entertainment and creativity have to be married with the visions of humanity, compassion, and justice. And more than anything, for those of you who share that, I've simply come to tell you to keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Leadership is not just about getting people to change, it's about getting people to want to change, to inspire people to become champions of the change, and that's what I'll be talking about. How do you do that? The central challenge of leadership. Most stories do not work. Most stories, in fact, often have the opposite effect of what a leader intends. In order to use stories effectively, you have to understand the pattern of an effective leadership story. First of all, it's a true story. It actually happened. Go to Zambia, check it out. It actually happened. It's the truth of the story that can wake people out of their complacency. And when I say true, I don't just mean factually accurate as far as it goes. I mean a story that's authentically true. When people go and check it out, and believe me, they will, they say, yeah, that's pretty much what happened. I mean, here's an example of a story that's factually accurate as far as it goes, but it has a little problem. 700 happy passengers reached New York after the Titanic's maiden voyage. End of story. Now, you tell the story in that format. Problem is, people find out, if they don't already know, ship sank, 1,500 people drowned. And when that is known, the backlash on the story, absolutely catastrophic. And this, in fact, is one of the most common leadership mistakes in using storytelling, is to tell a Titanic story. Tell a story that omits some crucial detail, which, when it becomes known, has a catastrophic effect on the leader and the story. So the first element, true story. Secondly, it's a story that's positive in tone. You get attention with negative stories, but in order to inspire people, Hollywood is right, it has to have a happy ending. And the reasons for this come out of neuroscience, because when you're telling a negative story, say about a firm that went bankrupt because they did not implement knowledge management, then those little gadgets are kicking into action. The reptile brain is going, wake up, something bad is happening. And the human brain can intervene and say, now calm down, reptile brain. We may actually learn something from this instructive experience. And the human brain will generally win that debate. But does the person rush out into action? No. They're recovering from another encounter with the reptile brain. But if on the other hand, you tell a positive story about how you got the answer and solved the problem and moved into the future, then what seems to be happening is the limbic system is providing what's called an endogenous opiate reward to the cortex. It basically puts the brain on drugs, injects a substance called dopamine into parts of the brain, and creates a mild sense of euphoria, sort of warm and floaty feeling, a wonderful feeling we have after we've just seen a great movie. Wow, I feel terrific. Change the organization? No problem. Let's do it. And it is told in a very strange way. It's told in a minimalist fashion. These are not like entertainment stories about the sights and the smells and the sounds of what it was like. No, these are very stripped down, streamlined stories. In fact, there are two listeners. You look out at an audience, looks like one listener per person. No, there's two. There's the listener you see, and there's also the little voice in the head. And we all know what the little voice in the head is, but if you are sitting there and asking yourself, I wonder what Steve means by the little voice in the head, that's the little voice I mean. The little voice that you hear all day, every day of your life, hugely important. And it may be drowning out everything I'm saying. I'm talking about Zambia, and the little voice is saying, I should never have come to this session this afternoon, got all these things to do. Maybe drowning out everything I'm saying. And conventional communication says, well, just ignore that, hope for the best. But you can do better than that. You can give the little voice something to do. And the task that you assign to the little voice in the head is to tell a new story. And in fact, it's this new story that drives the listener into action. Because I'm telling about Zambia, but you don't work in Zambia. But if you have some knowledge and you're thinking, well, I could be sharing my knowledge. Of course, I'd have to have a website. I'd have to get resources. I'd have to get more people involved. Why don't I do it? I've just had a great idea. And once it becomes the listener's idea, that's when you're off to the races. If it's my idea only, nothing much happens. When it becomes the listener's idea, that's when they become champions of the idea.
We all love stories. We're born for them. Stories affirm who we are. We all want affirmations that our lives have meaning. And nothing does a greater affirmation than when we connect through stories. It can cross the barriers of time, past, present, and future, and allow us to experience the similarities between ourselves and through others, real and imagined. The children's television host, Mr. Rogers, always carried in his wallet a quote from a social worker that said, "Frankly, there isn't anyone you couldn't learn to love once you've heard their story." And the way I like to interpret that is probably the most greatest story commandment, which is, make me care. Please, emotionally, intellectually, aesthetically, just make me care. It confirms something I really had a hunch on, is that the audience actually wants to work for their meal. They just don't want to know that they're doing that. That's your job as a storyteller, is to hide the fact that you're making them work for their meal. We're born problem solvers. We're compelled to deduce and to deduct, because that's what we do in real life. It's this well-organized absence of information that draws us in. There's a reason that we're all attracted to an infant or a puppy. It's not just that they're damn cute. It's because they can't completely express what they're thinking and what their intentions are. And it's like a magnet. We can't stop ourselves from wanting to complete the sentence and fill it in. In 1998, I had finished writing Toy Story and A Bug's Life, and I was completely hooked on screenwriting. So I wanted to become much better at it and learn anything I could. So I researched everything I possibly could, and I finally came across this fantastic quote by a British playwright, William Archer. "Drama is anticipation mingled with uncertainty." It's an incredibly insightful definition. When you're telling a story, have you constructed anticipation? In the short term, have you made me want to know what will happen next? But more importantly, have you made me want to know how it will all conclude in the long term? Have you constructed honest conflicts with truth that creates doubt in what the outcome might be? An example would be in Finding Nemo. In the short tension, you were always worried, would Dory's short-term memory forget whatever she was being told by Marlin? But under that was this global tension of, will we ever find Nemo in this huge, vast ocean? So when we pitched Toy Story to Tom Hanks for the first time, he walked in and he said, "You don't want me to sing, do you?" And I thought that epitomized perfectly what everybody thought animation had to be at the time. But we really wanted to prove that you could tell stories completely different in animation. So we didn't have any influence then, so we had a little secret list of rules that we kept to ourselves, and they were no songs, no I want moment, no happy village, no love story. And the irony is that in the first year, our story was not working at all, and Disney was panicking. So they privately got advice from a famous lyricist who I won't name, and he faxed them some suggestions, and we got a hold of that fax. And the fax said there should be songs, there should be an I Want song, there should be a Happy Village song, there should be a love story, and there should be a villain. And thank goodness we were just too young, rebellious, and contrarian at the time. That just gave us more determination to prove that you could build a better story. And a year after that, we did conquer it. And it just went to prove that storytelling has guidelines, not hard, fast rules. Another fundamental thing we learned was about liking your main character. And we had naively thought, well, Woody in Toy Story has to become selfless at the end, so you got to start from someplace, so let's make him selfish. And this is what you get.
What do you think you're doing? Off the bed. Hey, off the bed!
You gonna make us, Woody?
No, he is. Slinky! Slinky! Get up here and do your job! Are you deaf? I said take care of them!
I'm sorry, Woody, but I have to agree with them. I don't think what you did was right.
What? Am I hearing correctly? You don't think I was right? Who said your job was to think, Spring Wiener?
Why?
How do you make a selfish character likable? We realize, well, you can make him kind, generous, funny, considerate, as long as one condition is met for him, is that he stays the top toy. And that's what it really is that we all live life conditionally. We're all willing to play by the rules and follow things along as long as certain conditions are met. After that, all bets are off. Before I'd even decided to make storytelling my career, I can now see key things that happened in my youth that really sort of opened my eyes to certain things about story. In 1986, I was truly understood the notion of story having a theme. And that was the year that they restored and re-released Lawrence of Arabia. And I saw that thing 7 times in 1 month. I couldn't get enough of it. I could just tell there was a grand design under it. There was, in every shot, every scene, every line. Yet on the surface, it just seemed to be depicting his historical lineage of what went on. Yet there was something more being said. What exactly was it? And it wasn't until on one of my later viewings that the veil was lifted, and it was in a scene where he's walked across the Sinai Desert, and he's reached the Suez Canal, and I suddenly got it. That was the theme. Who are you? Here were all these seemingly disparate events and dialogues that just were chronologically telling the history of him, but underneath it was a constant, a guideline, a roadmap. Everything Lawrence did in that movie was an attempt for him to figure out where his place was in the world. A strong theme is always running through a well-told story. When I was 5, I was introduced to possibly the most major ingredient that I feel a story should have, but is rarely invoked. And this is what my mother took me to when I was 5.
Come on, it's all right. Look, the water is stiff. Some fun, huh, Bambi? Come on, get up, like this. No.
I walked out of there wide-eyed with wonder. And that's what I think the magic ingredient is, the secret sauce, is can you invoke wonder? Wonder is honest, it's completely innocent, it can't be artificially evoked. For me, there's no greater ability than the gift of another human being giving you that feeling. To hold them still just for a brief moment in their day and have them surrender to wonder. When it's tapped, the affirmation of being alive, it reaches you almost to a cellular level. And when an artist does that to another artist, it's like you're compelled to pass it on. It's like a dormant command that's suddenly activated in you, like a call to Devil's Tower. Do unto others what's been done to you. The best stories infuse wonder.
And then when I moved on to studying hero archetypes, I thought, oh, okay, the presenter's the hero, they're up on stage, they're the star of the show. And it's really easy to feel that way as the presenter, that you're the star of the show. Well, I realized right away that that's really broken, because I have an idea, I can put it out there, but if you guys don't grab that idea and hold it as dear, that idea goes nowhere and the world has never changed. So in reality, the presenter isn't the hero, the audience is the hero of our idea. So, I want to show you some of the findings that led up to what I think I've uncovered as a presentation form. So it was obvious to start with Aristotle. He had a 3-act structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end. We studied poetics and rhetoric. And a lot of presentations don't even have that in its most simple form. So in its most simple structure, it's a 3-part structure of a story. You have a likable hero who has a desire, and they encounter a roadblock, and ultimately they emerge transformed. And that's the basic structure. So at the beginning of any presentation, you need to establish what is. You know, here's the status quo, here's what's going on. And then you need to compare that to what could be. Now you need to make that gap as big as possible, because there's the commonplace of the status quo, and you need to contrast that with the loftiness of your idea. So it's like, you know, here's the past, here's the present, but look at our future. Here's a problem, but look at that problem removed. Here's a roadblock. Let's annihilate the roadblocks. You need to really amplify that gap. This would be like the inciting incident in a movie. It's when suddenly the audience has to contend with what you just put out there, and they have to say, wow, do I want to agree with this and align with it or not? And then the rest of your presentation should support that. So after you've moved back and forth between what is and what could be, the last turning point is a call to action, which every presentation should have. But at the very end, you need to describe the world as a new bliss. This is utopia with my idea adopted. This is the way the world is going to look when we join together and we solve this big problem. So you need to use that as your ending in a very poetic and a dramatic way.
So we know that there are millions of people who want to write, who want to tell stories. But we also know that most of the time what they write isn't very good. In fact, it's extremely boring. Why is it so difficult? And the answer is partly because you've got to remember the story is much more about the audience than it is about the characters or the plot, and it's much more about the audience than it is about the storyteller. Actually, Aristotle then described the formula, and he did that 2,500 years ago. Not only did it work then, it still works today. So actually, anyone who says there's no formula is wrong. There is. And Aristotle did it in a way that makes it incredibly easy to remember. There's 3 words: pity, fear, and catharsis. He said you need to make the audience feel pity for a character. You do that usually by making the character go through some undeserved misfortune. What that does is it enables the audience to emotionally connect with the character. And once the writer has got that emotional connection between the audience and the character, the writer begins to have some control over the audience. You then put the character into a worse and worse and worse situation. And because of the emotional connection, the identification, the audience feels fear. When you release the character from the jeopardy or whatever the situation they're in, the audience experiences a catharsis. Pity, fear, catharsis. And if, while you're egotistically trying to get immortality, while you're trying to make the world a better place, while you're trying to get back at people who put you down, please don't forget, you have to entertain us. You have to enable us to look at ourselves. Because when we're looking up at the screen, we're not looking at the actors who are saying your wonderful lines. We're not looking at the characters you have so lavishly and lovingly created. We're certainly not looking at you. We're looking at ourselves. Because only we are the storytellers, and only we can give you immortality. Thank you.
Okay, have you guys seen Elizabeth Gilbert's amazing talk on TED.com? Do you guys know this one? Raise your hand and make a ground twist. All right. So when I was at TED a year and a half ago, this was just the talk of TED. It was amazing. It was creative. It was really insightful. It was educational. It was passionate. And it was so just conversational and light. She just got up there and just talked so lightheartedly. So when the conference was done, I went up to her and we were talking for a minute. And I said, so fill me in. What's new? She said, well, I just finished my new book on New Year's Eve. And since TED happens around mid-February, I said, congrats. So have you finally had 6 weeks to get a vacation? And she said, no. She said, the minute I finished my book, the next day, I started working on my TED Talk. And that's all I've been doing for the last 6 weeks, full-time. I said, 6 weeks, full-time. So that's 8 hours a day, 240 hours for one 18-minute talk? And she said, yeah. So that's sprezzatura. It's this Italian word that means to hide conscious effort, to accomplish difficult actions with casual nonchalance. It's a kind of a artistic effortlessness that we can all strive for. But what I noticed, though, is that while her amazing talk inspired the hell out of me just for the talk itself, I think I was actually more inspired knowing how much work she put into it. So I thought that while all of us can kind of aspire to this elegant sprezzatura, perhaps there's a way to kind of let people know how much work goes into things afterwards to let them know that they can do it too.